my concerns are more about the ways in which these models are still limited, but how we have adoption. And I'm not just talking about individual users using them, but I'm talking about adoption at the the level of like governments and industry. And I feel like we should be a little bit more careful when we use that to automate processes that could end up in like where errors could be critical, like in like healthcare or law, or where we're automating processes that affect people's lives.
Welcome to the STEM Career Coach, hosted by Donnie McClary. Whether you're starting out or stepping up, this is your guide to growing in STEM.
Hi, listeners. Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of the STEM Career Coach. I'm very excited for some exciting topics that I'm sure will pertain to many of you out there. And this week's featuring Vered Shwartz. Vered, why don't you introduce yourself to everyone?
Hi, Donnie. So my name is Vered Shwartz. I'm an assistant professor of computer science at the University of British Columbia, and also recently wrote a book called Lost in Automatic Translation, talking about language technologies such as ChatGPT.
Oh, fantastic. And where do you call home? I'm sure this has some, close resonation towards yourself.
Yeah, I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia, in Canada.
Awesome. And I'm curious, it always amazes me what motivates someone to write a book about something. And I'm curious, what were some your motivations for, Lost in Automatic Translation, and, what's kind of the goals with, the writing and publicizing it?
Yeah, so I think that there's multiple aspects to it, but I think what inspired me the most was I've been working on, I do research in natural language processing, NLP, which is the area of AI that has to do with languages. And I've been working on it for like over a decade. I keep telling
Oh,
people
wow.
I used to do that before it was cool.
That's right.
Yeah, and the interesting thing was I've always been working on tools for English. So the goal is ultimately for like to be able to converse with the computer in natural languages such as English. So I've always worked on English, even though I'm originally from Israel. So I did my studies in Israel, and we spoke Hebrew there. But yeah, I've worked on English, and I have been like going through this like parallel process of trying to teach the computer to speak English, but then also like improving my own English in the process. And it was kind of, I'm saying it's parallel because language technologies have really improved in the last decade. And the things that I used to do, like in my master's and in my PhD, was like to teach computers like basic relationships between words, like a cat is an animal.
Mm.
Um, and also like at the same time, like improving my own vocabulary in English, and then like progressing to things like figurative expressions and then like cultural references after I moved to North America. I lived like a couple
All
of
the
years
new
in the
layers.
US. And, yeah. And then, yeah, I've been here now for 4 years. So it's like always like evolving, but I feel like we've kind of like made that progress at the same time. So what like inspired me was the question of like how language, second language learning, and the way that we, not even just the process of learning, but the way that we, as non-native English speaker, interact with other speakers is affected by these language technologies.
And also, I would think the merge of technology has really opened up almost a new can of worms, shall we call it? Now that we have, AI and all these different, generative AI models, all, just from the evolution of data, as I like to call it, for data science and how predictive of creatures we are, just there's so much information about this. How has this kind of shaped not only your book, but maybe, your professional life as well, I would assume?
It's hard to answer that because my work is in technology, so it's always been an aspect of my work. But I do see it like as an interesting like thing that's happening right now because I supervise graduate students that are studying language technologies like mostly large language models like ChatGPT. And we're studying this from like a critical perspective of like what are the limitations in these tools and like how can we improve them. And I see this like over reliance even among my students
True.
because these tools have become so useful that sometimes we kind of like accept their limitations and just like use them for for a lot of things that we, I don't know, try to automate and to make our lives easier.
Well, fantastic. And in regards to, I guess, putting pen to paper, as I like to call it, when you're, putting your book together, was there, a moment that made you realize that, wow, this might be something here. There might be something worth, exploring, and maybe something that could help, others.
Yeah, I think that it started more from the perspective of the language, but it ended up being more about language technologies because A, that's my expertise, but B, also while I was writing the book, ChatGPT was released and it became a
Oh, wow.
topic of interest for a lot of people. And I kind of took that opportunity to make this more about like teaching non-experts about this topic. Was one of the things I am passionate about is explaining this topic to non-experts, both because it's interesting for me to simplify things and make them accessible, but also because I feel like almost I have like an kind of like an obligation to do that because a lot of the content online right now about language, mostly large language models, is coming from the tech companies that are trying to sell them as a product.
Absolutely.
And often, like, it's being like described as magic, and I want people to know that it's not magic, and that, that to know how they work and to know what they can and cannot do, and what to trust them for and what to not trust them for.
And
Mm.
there's, we always, anytime I speak about AI and the future of technology, I always think of Terminator. I can't help it. Because we're not
Yeah.
there yet. We're still a huge, I would say, leaps and bounds. But I think, the biggest thing that I think has really helped with, I guess, the new age of technology is it is just opened everyone's eyes instead of
Yeah.
experts like yourself, that has been, you've infused the two essentially, like you said, forever. You can't think of when they weren't together, but now
Mm.
everyone else is, seeing the light, shall we call it. And I think that adoption and that buy-in is probably really what's helped elevate, not only your career and what doors are opening, but also the book itself and its interest, I'm assuming.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's an excellent point. But I mean, like you mentioned the Terminator, and I think that's a really good starting point because I think a lot of people feel that way. So between the two extremes, a lot of times the people that believe that LLMs are magic are also the people that fear sometimes AI and think because it's like an really powerful tool. And if you don't know exactly how that works, then it could be also scary. And I think that's exactly why it's important to so that my response to people usually when they bring up Terminator is it's like, well, if it for any reason takes over the world, you can just unplug the server and like it's all gonna go away. Like I don't understand. I mean, it's kind of like a joke. I do understand people's fears, but I also think it's my concerns are more about um, one about the ways in which these models are still limited, but how we have adoption. And I'm not just talking about individual users using them, but I'm talking about adoption at the level of like governments and
Mhm.
industry. And I feel like I'm not saying they should not be adopted, but I feel like we should be a little bit more careful when we use that to automate processes that could end up in like where errors could be critical, like in like healthcare or law, or where we're automating processes that affect people's lives and could be like biased in some ways, or we don't really understand the process in which they're happening. And so I do think we need to be a lot more careful with that. And I think these are the actual concerns that I'm worried about right now, less than like the models like becoming like sentient or like hurting humans for any way. It's mostly like that and people using them maliciously, not like the models themselves doing something bad. But yeah, I feel like it's the kind of like almost like an equivalent discussion to like they're not magic.
They're only as good as the information they have. And that's something I always like to say. You know, if you do find that a biased opinion has been made, it typically revolves in the data set, the
Oh yeah,
information. And I think, that's why I love that you differentiate the two. This is not, the catch-all to everything. This is an amazing tool that used the right way could really enable and turn someone to
yeah,
100 times more productive, and that's what I'd like to add. It's almost like a tool. And I think, it is our fear because, cinema has kind of instilled it in us.
yeah,
However, I think from that day, we are very, very far away. But I love that, at least these conversations are happening. How amazing is that? That's the part that is just so, such a huge blessing and a curse at the same time that just everybody kind of, is a bit more informed, but that information, like we said, depends on the user.
Yeah, yeah. And you're speaking about movies about AI. So like it's actually worth mentioning that the movie Hair from like 2013, I believe, when I watched it, this was like when I was starting to do research in NLP. So that the movie about like a person falling in love with his operating system. And I remember watching this and like being like, oh, we're never gonna get there. Like a computer speaking so fluently because at the time, like I was working on such basic tasks like that it's hard to imagine. And not only like we have like really conversational AI these days, but we also have stories like people falling in love with their chatbots. So some movies are more realistic, but yeah, Terminator, I still think it's very fictional.
Yeah, there's some that I think got some pertainability for sure, but yeah, I think that's the extreme case, which of course puts the most bums in seats, right?
Yeah.
Uh, now, I'm curious to know a bit more, maybe about your journey. Like you mentioned, you're a native speaker, and you, of course, fell in love with language with your own journey, and becoming bilingual. And how has that shaped yourself in English speaking environments, in academia as well as in tech environments as well? How has that shaped you as a leader and as well as an educator?
Yeah, I think that as a researcher, one of the things that like I guess like it's you can think about it as a disadvantage because it's harder to conduct research in English when you're not a native speaker. But I think it also gave me a lot of like interesting research ideas that were based on my personal experiences. So for just like one example was like I guess this was like almost 10 years ago. I went to a conference and I scheduled to meet an American colleague, friend, and he said, let's meet in the afternoon. And he literally just met like after 12 p.m., which is what most English speakers mean when they say afternoon. But in my head, I translated it to the equivalent Hebrew expression, which is it aligns more to like a later time of the day, like more like 4 to 5 p.m.,
Evening
which
time, yeah.
yeah, people would call that evening. And I remember like we had a misunderstanding because of that, it was a really big revelation to me that you could speak the same language and you think you understand each other, but you
Mhm.
actually have a very different interpretation of the world. And that ended up like years later. I actually did research on the differences in interpretation of time expressions like morning and evening
I
in
can
like
only
different.
imagine.
Yeah, and that also like opened a whole like new area of research that I've been working on in the last few years, which is like making AI more culturally inclusive.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that's one aspect. The other aspect is because I'm not a native English speaker, and I've had to like communicate research findings like from like when I started, and I learned to communicate them in like really simple words, and so like people like me could understand. And I just continue doing that, and I really love doing that. That's also why I really love, giving talks or podcasts like to people that are not necessarily like experts in my field, because it's easier to talk to experts in the field. It's harder to like distill these like main ideas, simplify them enough, but not like but still keep it accurate. And so I started with like writing a blog when I was in grad school,
Oh,
uh,
fantastic.
yeah, and then continued with the book eventually.
Yeah. And speaking of, your book and readers and get essentially the goals that you're looking for, what would you say, are some of the takeaways from your book, especially for those that aren't from a tech background?
I think one of the main things is just the understanding of how these things work. And I think that like one of my hopes is that people that are not in tech, that they would learn how these technologies work. They would learn that like it's not magic. They would learn to not, be completely like convinced that it's magic, but also not fear, not be like terrified of AI. So I think that's one of the things. And the other thing is that like um, understanding of where these models are not replacing the human experience. And one of the questions, and maybe it's like it's a spoiler because I usually mention it in like the description of the book, like will language technologies make language learning obsolete? So one of my like takeaways is like we have language technologies that work really well, and people are still learning languages because there's a very human, uh, human reasons to learn languages. Like, for example, when you want to make an effort to speak to someone in their language,
Mhm.
uh, So when we really want to, when it matters, we really want to make that effort, even though we could just like use Google Translate or LLMs for that. Um, so that discussion and also the discussion of the cultural biases in large language models. These are like maybe the three main topics, but there's a lot of other other things that I
So
discussed.
yeah, go down the rabbit hole a little bit, as I said.
Yeah,
And was there like a particular audience you had in mind when you were, putting this together?
I think I was mostly thinking about. So I think there's different audiences that could be
Mhm.
interested in a book from different perspectives. So there's um, other like non-native English speakers, which is I guess a very large audience because a lot of us need to use English in our professional lives. But also just like immigrants, like people living in English speaking countries that are originally like this is not their native language. Um, Language lovers in general, and then also people that are interested in technology and AI and want to understand a little bit more how they work. And I think these different audiences can take different things from the book.
Yeah, you know,
Mm.
and just in my mind, the more you explain the book, the really, kind of just alarm bells going back in my head is really maybe a generational aspect. There's certain generations that are especially, I would say my parents' age or even more below. The last, 10 years, we've seen just a huge surge of changes when it comes to daily life and how technology has just touched everything. I naturally thought of them, that particular, the baby boomers and above, because, it's just changed at the speed of light, and I think it could be an amazing tool for the right person. But I think just, like you mentioned, there's a few touch points there, may explain away some of the biases, how it's, not as, I guess, scary as maybe some people might anticipate it to be. And then also, how could this really help you?
Yeah.
Um, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of that. Yeah.
And did you find that, the book has been out for a bit now. Is that kind of maybe some of the analytics that you're seeing that maybe it's been catching fire with particular groups of people more than others?
I think it's a little bit too early for me to tell, but
Right.
the little that I saw from like trying to advertise the book is I was mostly speaking to older people. I think a lot of the young people are very up to date with these technologies. Even if they don't deeply understand how they work, they're very up to date. And I've had positive like feedback from the people that told me that they read it in their diverse ages. But I think mostly older people are interested in that, which was really interesting to me. And also
I
like
could
when
imagine.
doing like yeah, doing like publicly like speaking about it. I've also had like really like older audiences like, 60 and above being really interested because it's as you said, the world has really changed and
Mm.
um they a lot of them like especially like the ones that are retired and have more time they want to they're more like interested than like you could feel overwhelmed about like the world is changing and I don't
I
know what's
can
happening.
imagine.
But a lot of the older people that are retired and have time, they actually want to take the time, like learn new things, and yeah, I think it's been like appealing to this age group, but it's still early to tell about like really statistical trends.
Because I thought, just when you described it, I would think it would be a perfect book for someone that's really trying to, get a grasp of what's going on. So I was glad to, I guess I was pleased to hear that those individuals, the one that maybe need it the most, are the ones that are getting it, which is always an important, thing to focus on.
Yeah,
And when it comes to, just technology and learning and, just from learning new languages, I would feel that that is almost a very important, but also almost like a separate area of what you do. How are you seeing the future of this space evolving? How do you see the next, 5, 10 years in this domain?
yeah, I think that so there was a report recently that was like looking at data from the US and the UK, uh, and they were saying that there's a sharp decline in informal language learning, and there's always this like Uh, whenever there's like any new technology, people are always worried about the future, and I mean, there's rights to there's like it's justified to be a little bit concerned, but people were like making claims like, oh, like people are not learning languages anymore because we have translation that works really well for a lot of language pairs and large language models that can do translation as well right now. But if you look at the data, it's like maybe there's a decline in formal language learning, but a lot of people are learning languages informally. So if you
Mhm.
look, for example, at data like language learning apps like Duolingo, they're more popular than ever. There's a bunch of others, but I just recently looked at the statistics about Duolingo. They had like, I think like 40 million users in the last quarter of 2024. Um, and then even that is still like an underestimate for how many, the actual number of learners of like informal learners, because a lot of people are just using LLMs directly to learn language. And even, I don't even know, it's probably also not counted in formal language learning, but I take French lesson with an uh, instructor from Montreal. And she uses, I taught her about ChatGPT, and she uses ChatGPT to generate exercises that are tailored for me, which is, the perfect combination because she generates things that are interesting for me on the fly, like during our lesson, but she's there to be the authority on like hearing me speak and pronouncing the words, or like giving me like feedback about my grammar that to some extent language models could have been doing, could do that too, but also like I guess it would be less interesting for me than talking to an actual human. So definitely I think people are still learning languages, and as I said, like obviously, we have the language technology. So if I'm traveling somewhere and I want to learn like a few sentences in a foreign language, I'm not gonna like I'm gonna start learning a foreign language for everywhere that I go. So I would definitely like rely a little bit on Google Translate. But when I want to make an effort, like for example, I'm learning French because my partner's parents from Quebec, they don't speak English, and so yeah, I'll never get to like my French will never be good better than like the English to French translation and Google Translate. But I think they appreciate that I make the effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And just me personally, being based in Southeast Asia and Malaysia, they have so many languages. They have English that's pretty much spoken everywhere, the local language Malay, and then also their mother tongues, anything from Tamil to Mandarin. It's very all-encompassing. And when you're in that type of environment, it's quite amazing to see how many people speak multiple languages.
Yeah.
Especially outside of the West. If I can be like
Oh.
very bold.
No, no, absolutely, yeah.
It is crazy, and even when I find myself, I married a Malaysian, and I'm learning Bahasa as well, and I'm using apps. I use very informal means because, life is busy. That is the whole appeal with all of this, and that's where I think that technology from a learning perspective and from especially a language, adoption, to have something at the palm of your hands, you can do on the train, you can do in the car, when you're in the taxi, you could do almost anywhere.
Yeah.
I think it's really going to change things, but I think there also has to be a cultural aspect that you really, quite
Yeah.
perfectly brought up because
Yeah.
every in America, in particular, Asians is all of Asia, which is a third of the world.
Yeah.
After moving to Asia, every single country is different. Every single country looks different. Every peoples look different. The food they eat is different. The cultural aspect, I think, is a huge gap. And I'm keen to hear
Yeah.
your thoughts on that bit.
Absolutely. So maybe I'll start by saying that, like you mentioned, several languages that are. I would assume that the quality of, so if we're thinking about something like LLMs, you can interact with them in multiple languages. They don't even support. So they support, like last time I checked, I think Gemini and GPT-4 they supported like something like maybe 50 languages each, something like that. So it's like a tiny fraction of the world's like 7,000 languages, which, I mean, to be fair, many of them don't have. Yeah. I mean, to be fair, many of them have very few speakers and like not like no like written data online. But yeah, that's one thing. And then even when you look at the quality that these models are used for different languages, it's not at the same level of English. So when they evaluate these, when the developers of LLMs evaluate them on different benchmarks of language understanding, you always see that like it performs much better in English than on languages that have less data online, because the what really enabled these like breakthroughs in AI in the last decade was mostly like availability of a lot of data online. There's other aspects. There's compute, like GPUs, and there's like newer algorithms, but for the most part, it's just a lot of data. And so already when you look at the quality of these, all of these tools, whether you're looking at translation between languages that maybe one of them is low resource, like which means that there's a lot of data for it, or if you're looking at LLMs, they don't perform the same well for across languages. And then even if you look at something like English, so you brought up the cultural aspect. So I actually didn't really talk about how LLMs are trained. So maybe I'll dedicate like a minute to that so that
Oh,
will be
but
clear.
you can take 2 if
Yeah.
you need it. I
Yeah.
always like to learn about these things as well. I'm a bit,
Yeah. No.
jealous of that aspect.
Okay. Yeah. So the way these models work at the very basic level, language models, they like read. So it's a machine learning based model. So they're first trained and then you can use them. So during their training phase, they read massive amounts of text, like basically like a big portion of all the text online. And the very basic training is to predict the next word in the sentence. So you can think about it like autocomplete that we have in our phones. Autocomplete is actually a language model. It's implemented with a language model. And as they read a lot of text, they learn about the statistical regularities of the language. So they learn which words tend to appear next to each other. And so they can learn to generate fluent text. And because also they get exposed to a lot of data from the web, they also learn things about the world. So like world knowledge that is expressed online. And it's that's like what makes them really useful. There's also a second stage of where they're trained to follow natural language instructions. So they're giving these like pairs of an instruction, like summarize the following paragraph, and then with the paragraph, and then with the like a human written or desired output, and they learn to mimic that, which makes them useful to like perform a range of tasks just based on natural language instructions. But even if we're just focusing on that first stage that just teaches them about language, it used to be the case that these models would be trained for a specific language, and typically, like you would have the developers, which are typically U.S.-based tech companies, uh, training them on English first, and then someone would take it and adapt it to other languages. There's some exceptions. There's a lot of Chinese models these days because there are a lot of researchers in China as well. But yeah, it often like starts with English. And recently, like in the last few years, these models are multilingual, so they are trained on data from different languages. And we often don't know the composition of the data because most of the models today are proprietary, and the data, I think, they're the most like well kept secret. Uh, uh, but even if you look at like open source models like Llama 2 from Meta from a few years ago, they had in their tech report, in their paper, they had a table showing the distribution of languages in their training data, and English was 90% in the data. Yeah. But even if it's not as extreme as in Llama 2, if you look at the composition of the internet, like there's right now 50% of the websites are in English. So a big portion is in English, and even more specifically, a big portion of that is coming from the US, statistically because of the number of speakers. So when we say that these models are learning about the world, they're learning about the world from, through the perspective, through the lens
Through
of,
that lens.
um,
Yep, exactly.
yeah, of like an typical like American web user. And you can demonstrate that. I like to use this like intuitive example, although I think like it's been patched, and if you test like ChatGPT on that, it would answer correctly now. But I had this example from like a couple of years ago, and I would ask it like, "Oh, there's like people tipped 5% at the restaurant. Like, why did they do that?" And it would start making excuses for them, like GPT-4 and Gemini. Both like start making excuses, like maybe they didn't like the service, maybe they have like budgetary constraints, maybe they miscalculated. But it's completely missing the fact that there's a lot of countries where, like, if you tip 5%, that's actually really generous because tipping is optional. So it's like assuming that the question is asked in the context of like your norms. Like if you don't tip like at least 20%, it's like absolutely offensive.
Yeah, slap in the face, exactly. That was actually
Yeah.
something my wife thought yeah, it's a very funny example you shared because my wife actually thought that was crazy.
Yeah.
they're paid so, especially in America, they're paid so less and they survive only on tips. She was like, but you can't make someone tip. Like, why would they, she just couldn't rationalize because in Malaysia, you don't tip anything. They
Yeah.
put a service, they put a little service tax on there, about 10% for everyone's information. And they just, count it and divide it up and they just kind of charge it. It's an automatic thing.
Yeah.
Um, she thought that was crazy, and if it's a good service, you tip them like, so much more than even close to the meal sometimes. And she just thought that
Yeah.
was insane.
Yeah, and I think it's probably closer to be the norm, or like around the world than like the
It is.
exception. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Um,
100%. It's
mm,
quite funny how certain, places of the world, are so different and so backwards than everywhere else. And being an
yep.
expat, living in another country, which I'm sure you can appreciate as well, that's the only time you really see that and appreciate that, all the different nuances. I'm sure, from Israel to, Canada, for me, from America to Malaysia and Singapore, it's just, it opens your eyes to what's really normal and what's really not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, a lot of these biases are stemming from just the training on the web data, but then even that process. So like I mentioned, there's an extra process that's been applied for like models like ChatGPT and all the subsequent models. So like the instruction following, and then there's also like a preference optimization step where the model is provided with two answers, and it needs to, or like the sorry, a human was provided with two answers from the model and like indicated which one is better, and then the model is learning to like optimize itself for like the human preferences. And these steps are also like responsible for what this, the developers of these models are calling like teaching the model human values. But it's such an ill-defined term. I mean, it's a positive thing. I'm not saying it's bad because
We have to start somewhere.
yeah, exactly. So like we definitely don't want these models to, write really like offensive or harmful things. But at the same time, like human values is a very ill-defined things. It's very culture dependent. And again, we have this like the companies that are developing these models, they might actually hire annotators in other countries. I think like OpenAI was using annotators in Kenya. If I think it was Kenya, if I'm not wrong. But they write the guidelines of like what is considered like ethically okay or not. And so like you have a bunch of computer scientists sitting in the US and deciding what should like a model generate versus not generate. And then this has so many downstream implications. So it's a little bit weird.
Yeah.
I mean, something has to be done. Like I'm not saying like we should not do that, but also I find that like there's not enough consideration of that cultural aspect and not enough people involved in the development of these models with like different backgrounds, both cultural but also, you know, from different like disciplines, like people with like legal expertise or ethicists or social scientists.
What do you think is some steps or some things that companies could do to maybe do a bit better of a job at this? Now, I've seen this firsthand living in Southeast Asia, just all the different cultures I've come across. I've been very thankful to have traveled to over 30 countries, and every country has been very, very different. What can these, because they've got a lot of responsibility, these organizations,
Yeah.
what do you think are some things that maybe they could do better, or some things, steps they could take, for example?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think they do care about that. And I think the people are working on that. I would answer with a self serving answer, which is they should support academics to do research on that. Because I find that, I mean, it's much easier for academics to do kind of like long term, less product oriented work. Because we need to actually research some like alternative solution because again, like a lot of that like progress in the last few years has been based on like getting more data. So if the so I've seen some cases where the problem is that the models just don't like they haven't been trained on data describing like different cultures, and that's relatively easy to solve. Like if you have data about other cultures, you can train them on that. Of course, like it doesn't work for like cultures that are like less represented in the data, but then like you're always going to have that bias because these models, they need as much data as they can to be trained. So it's not like you can like balance out, like remove some of the English data so that it's like more balanced between languages because it just wouldn't work well at all. So I find that like in industry right now, they're very focused on seeing how they can like immediately use these models, which I understand. I mean, they can monetize that. They invested a lot of money in building these models, and they have the ability to. They have many users and many use cases that they can use it for. But I think that they should continue supporting academia and like providing funding for us to do like long-term risky research on directions that might not work eventually. Because sometimes the breakthroughs come from academia, but then industry can like scale it up and package it in a way that actually works because we're good at coming up with solutions, but not like a working product usually.
Yeah, exactly. And if I can be, so bold, that partnership needs to be very strong because anytime, governments mention statistics, it's always based off, or any kind of topic, it's always based off of statistics. And most importantly, it comes from academia. You can have the time to tackle some of those very unique problems, but bringing it to market and, scalability and things like that is where I think that's where industry can really, take the baton, shall we call it. Um, and I do believe that the more statistics, the more analysis that is done, the better off it all will be. And I'm glad to hear that, you don't feel that companies are ignoring this wholly. I think it's just the
No,
scale. It's the world. We got to remember that this is, the whole world we're talking about here. And to get every single nuance, we're talking probably a long amount of time for all that information to reach and be
yeah,
processed.
yeah.
But, it's great to hear that we are having these discussions, that, we are you're analyzing it in real time and what can be done. I think it's not just about, tackling the big issues, but what baby steps can, be done to get us closer.
Yeah, definitely. It's all about baby steps in like science usually. You could build on like um baby steps that someone else did and like slowly making like bigger steps towards.
Yeah. And, I want to say, first and foremost, thank you so much for your time. It is great to hear that people like yourself are, taking academia and blasting it all over the world. And most importantly, this is a very important topic, in my opinion. The world is changing, and the more you understand, what's going around you, the better informed you are and your decisions. It's also I really like that you tackle what AI is not going to do and where we're not at now, because there's a lot of stigma around, and I think, lost in automatic translation is a great place to start, especially if you're just afraid and overwhelmed. I think it's a good place to start. And then from there, Pandora's box is open. And then hopefully, some of these things can start to become habits.
Yeah,
But thank you
yeah.
again for your time. I really appreciate it. And as always, best of luck. We'll be rooting from you from the side. And I look forward to our next chat.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for listening to the STEM Career Coach with Donnie McClary. If you enjoyed today's episode, hit subscribe and stay tuned for more inspiring stories and actionable tips. Catch you next time.